Hello, thank you for joining us. Today we'll be speaking about the Kurds and Iran. Iran is home to the second largest Kurdish population in the world after Turkey. As in all regions of Kurdistan, Kurds in Iranian Kurdistan, or Rojhelat, experienced brutal and systematic violence throughout the 20th century under the Iranian state. Stemming from the regional development of the Kurdish freedom movement, the movement for democratic confederalism in Iran began to develop in the early 2000s, with the aims of realizing an autonomous, self-governing Kurdistan and a democratic federalist Iran. Since then, the Iranian regime's repression of the Kurdish population within its borders has remained extreme, with the state taking an approach of forceful assimilation through military means and the execution of any daring to oppose the regime. Today, we will be discussing the historical background of the Kurds and Iran, focusing on the issues of the modern Iranian nation-state, the relation between the state and the various nations and ethnicities within the modern Iranian territory, with a focus on the Kurds in particular, as well as the issue of the Kurds and borders in the modern so-called Middle East in the context of Iran. For insight on these issues, we will be speaking with Sara Kermanian. Sara is a PhD researcher in international relations at the University of Sussex. She was born and raised in Rojhelat, in the city of Kermanshah. She did her undergraduate in Tehran, where she was engaged with left-wing student activism. She was publishing a magazine in the University of Tehran with fellow socialist activists from 2005 to 2008. Sara is also a poet and has published a poetry book in Farsi. As a researcher, she is interested in the interplay of the relation of borders and subjectivity, time and scale, and historical transformation of these relations in creating uneven subject positions in the international system and the emergence of conflictual international imaginaries therein. Her current research addresses such questions in the projects of democratic confederalism and Neo-Ottomanism, and the implications of their contradictory yet co-constitutive relation for criticizing mainstream understandings of modern temporality. Sara, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. Maybe you can begin by giving us some general background on the Kurds in Iran.
The Kurds, with a population of around 30 to 30 million people, are the world's biggest stateless nation. As you just mentioned, with a population of around 10 million, the Kurdish region of Iran, Rojhelat, meaning Eastern Kurdish, is the second largest part of Kurdistan. Despite this, though, the Kurds of Rojhelat are highly underrepresented in media, academic scholarship, and they're pretty much marginalized in global negotiations about the future of the Kurdish question. Unlike other parts of Kurdistan, whose borders were drawn directly by mandate powers following the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement, the current borders of Rojhelat were drawn following the defeat of the Safavids by the Ottomans in the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, and a set of subsequent treaties which finally culminated in the Treaty of Zohab in 1639.
So following on from this point, the historical relation between the Kurds of Iranian Kurdistan and the Fars nation is unique, given that the borders dividing the Kurds and Rojhelat from the rest of Kurdistan are comparatively much older than those dividing the other parts of Kurdistan, that is in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Could you speak a bit about this history of the Kurds and the Fars nation?
Perhaps I'd better clarify some misconceptions about the relationship between the Kurds and the Iranian nation. There are a set of presumptions about the relationship between these two that has led to the mainstream result that perhaps the claim that Kurdistan is a colony cannot be applied to the Kurdish population in Iran, and that the Kurdish question in Iran could be solved independently from other parts of Kurdistan and within the bigger framework of the Iranian nation. This includes assuming, for instance, that Rojhelat's borders being natural compared to the artificial borders of other parts of Kurdistan, that the existence of historically durable coexistence of the Kurds with forces under continuous Persian empires, some cultural commonalities that imply the Kurds being part of the Iranian nation as a whole, modern dominant taxonomical narratives that categorize the Kurdish language and culture under the broad category of Indo-European, and also the fact that, unlike in other parts of Kurdistan, Iran has acknowledged the existence of the Kurds as one of the ethnic components of the puzzle of the Iranian nation, so much so that the only province that bears the name Kurdistan is located in Iran. So getting into the paradoxes of each of these assumptions is too long to be discussed here, but 2 points are worth mentioning. On the one hand, all these concepts and ideas, such as natural borders versus artificial borders, historical continuity of Persian empires, cultural commonalities or cultural commonalities signifying any relationship of subordination of some part to a whole, linguistic categories, and so on. These are not neutral signifiers, and they do not objectively correct facts. Rather, they are social, political, discursive constructs whose function is precisely to legitimize the form of politics that has necessitated their existence, and hence to delegitimize other forms of politics and the right of other communities to the practice of politics. The second point is, regardless of how historically accurate or mystical narratives about ancient empires are, which more often than not they are mystical, it's politically and methodologically wrong and misleading to ground the right of a people to self-determination in the modern era upon people's imperial past, and hence ignoring the violence underlying the process of forging a modern nation out of a presumably multicultural empire. In addition to these two paradoxes, there is historical evidence that the Kurds had a consciousness of their collective identity as distinct from those of the Turks, the Arabs, and Farsis, even before the modern time. For instance, the emergence of Yorasanism as a predominantly Kurdish religion in 14th century, whose principal book Saranjam, meaning conclusion in Kurdish, is written in Gorani Kurdish, is another evidence of the Kurds, of the existence of a Kurdish consciousness of their distinct identity, despite, even though not in the modern sense of the term consciousness as is associated with national consciousness.
I think there's a multitude of complex issues in this point that you're making here, that there was a collective sense of distinct Kurdish identity at this time, yet this was still not a national consciousness in the modern sense. How would you say that the national consciousness of the Kurds in Iran developed?
Well, of course, the Kurdish nation, national consciousness, just like any other nation's national consciousness and nationalism, is a modern phenomenon. And the main step towards the emergence of this national consciousness was paved parallelly and in relation to the process of the construction of the modern Iranian nation as a racially exclusive collectivity. So prior to this stage, the relationship between borders, sovereignty, and the political community was not linear. Qajars inherited from the Safavids a culturally and even to a degree socially, politically plural fabric. Of course, it was a form of a patrimonial pluralism that contained both features of tribalism and monarchy, but a kind of pluralism nonetheless. Safavids had announced Shia Islam as the official religion of the state, but still there was no singular identity binding the territory, the borders, and the center of power to a political community. Borders that were called hududs back then, meaning limits or boundaries, were marking the current end point of the area of the sovereignty of the state, rather than the end of a distinct political community. Neither did they have such a claim. From the 19th until the 20th century, Iran was the arena of the competition of European powers, particularly Russia, England, and later on Germany. The country, which already had lost a bulk of its territory following several wars with Russia, continued losing most of its Caucasian territories in the first half of the 19th century. In addition to this, European powers had divided the country basically among themselves and had become its de facto rulers. So, as many have argued, Iran was practically a de facto colony, despite not being an official colony, since it had basically very limited control over its domestic and international affairs. The fear of dismemberment coming from these interventions and territorial losses, the frustration of the constant weakening of the international and domestic power of the state, and all the political and economic problems that emerged following several wars and colonial interventions were at the center of constitutionalist concerns. So when the constitutional revolution began, constitutionalists demanded a powerful state that would protect the territory against both internal and external separating forces, and potential separating forces, of course. This required a simultaneous process of, on the one hand, centralizing the state, both its bureaucratic system and the army, and the construction of a unitary political community whose identity was tied to the territorial integrity of the country and whose identity would end with the borders. And of course, that required and that led to the deployment of various techniques of settling, internal colonialism, and etc. that were used in different stages of the process of the construction of the Iranian nation. And on the other hand, this collective unitary identity the constitutionalists envisioned brought about a racially exclusive vision of the nation, characterized by Farsi language and culture and Shia Islam as its main religion, that minoritized all identity groups under the broad name of the Iranian nation. So this transition to a racially exclusive and hence homogenized and unitary nation was a process through which an imperial structure transformed into a colonial nation state, which is a very problematic structure that Iran bears to the day. The point is, the project of the construction of the modern nation of Iran was a project that was as much anti-colonial in relation to the Western de facto occupiers as it was internally colonizing in relation to other non-Fars identity groups. And this process of this practice of resisting colonialism via colonizing others, resisting imperialism via imperializing others, indicate the hierarchical relations among non-Western communities and groups, a phenomenon which could be called inter-subaltern hierarchy. And it suggests a meticulous reconsideration of what is known as anti-colonial resistance and the very possibility of the coloniality of any act of anti-coloniality that is defined in Manichaean ontological frameworks. So one thing that I just want to put in parentheses is that given its geographical significance, Kurdish areas, particularly in southern parts of Rojhelat, their borders were quite sensitive matters. Hence, the process of controlling these borders began earlier than in other parts of Kurdistan. And lots of the cities along these borders began having non-local governors earlier than in other parts of the country. But still, this is too early to consider these administrative changes as the beginning of the process of the construction of the internal colonialism of the Iranian nation, which is a process that pretty much began and was kind of enforced by the rise of the constitutional revolution.
This general point that you're making here is foundationally important, and one that I think is not often made, that a colonized state resisting against the forces of global imperialism can be at the same time, as a result of that act of resistance itself, perpetuating colonization and imperialism on other peoples of the region or within their own state territory. This is the phenomenon that you referred to as inter-subaltern hierarchy. But this really calls into question the larger issue of anti-coloniality or anti-imperialism in general. Now, I think on the left, there is a tendency to only look at one side of this equation, that is active resistance against global imperialist forces, while ignoring the other side, or how that same actor interacts with the people or states of the region. And this logic has led certain tendencies on the left historically, and still continuing to this day, to support various oppressive regimes, such as Saddam or Assad or Khomeini. So this issue that you're raising here is really vital, I think, for developing a new understanding and a deeper understanding of anti-imperialism, which is vital for internationalism in the 21st century. But that's a whole conversation that would is too large to have here. I want to come back to the history of the Iranian state building. I'm wondering if you can say a bit about the transition from the Qajars to the emergence and development of the Iranian nation state, and how the national questions that we've been speaking about thus far were impacted by that process.
After the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty following the 1921 coup, the process of the modernization of the country and the imposition of the ideology of nationalism was more severely pursued. Reza Shah's top-down modernization processes, who's known as a father of Iranian modernity, somehow modernization, included a forceful sedentarization of nomads, which directly affected the Kurds and many other ethnic groups. It also included the imposition of Farsi as official language of the state and the nation, imposition of modern dress codes, etc. All of these actions further attacked the plurality of the society, as people's relationship to their land and culture here was undermined. He more severely pursued the use of military means and policing techniques, which certainly took substantial steps in strengthening the militarized characteristic of the racialized nation. Again, in parentheses, in many ways, Reza Shah's modernization had some secular elements, which, given its forceful pattern, particularly in opposing hijab and in forcing women to remove their hijab, paradoxically strengthened its religious counterpart, the religious version of Iranian nationalism. So minorities resisted this process and this forceful imposition of modernization norms wherever they could, particularly seizing the power vacuum after the World War I. Various revolts outbroke across the country. In Kurdistan, the Simku Rebellion, which still had tribal motivations, but it was an important point towards the development of national consciousness, began in 1919 and was brutally crushed after Reza Shah took power after the coup. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought another interpretation of modernity into the country. In 1946, the Democratic Party of Kurdistan, KDPI, which was backed by the Soviet Union, established the Republic of Mahabad under the leadership of Ghazi Muhammad. KDPI's motto was autonomy for Kurdistan in a democratic and federal Iran. The republic did not last more than 11 months, but was an important point in the development of Kurdish movement and national consciousness.
Thank you. And what about the relation between the Kurds and the 1979 revolution in Iran?
Kurds actively participated in the 1979 revolution, but more importantly, they resisted against the monopolization of the revolution by the Islamists. The most significant parties were KDPI, that I just mentioned, that was at this point was representing a more classic account of the Kurdish nationalism, and the Komala party that was representing a radical Marxist-Leninist line, especially after it merged with some non-Kurdish Marxist groups in 1983 and shaped the Communist Party of Iran. After the revolution, the KDPI and Komala forwarded a proposal that demanded autonomy within the boundaries of the sovereign state of Iran for the Kurds, the preservation of the right to practice their culture, the right to get an education in their mother tongue, the right to free passage and movement across the border, and also freedom of speech and press for everyone in the country, and so on. Despite its initial promises for supporting minorities' rights, the revolutionary government betrayed the Kurdish trust and did not approve the proposal. Both KDPI and Komala subsequently boycotted the March 1979 Islamic Republic's referendum on the ground that the temporary government's agenda is at best vague. However, few non-Kurdish organizations joined the Kurdish initiative, thus playing a role in one of the most tragic moments in the history of Iran.
Well, I think you're right in characterizing that moment as a tragic one. But I want to zero in a little bit further on this on these developments and the dynamics of that situation that you were just describing. So, if I understand you correctly, it was in this moment around the 1979 revolution, a lack of an organized movement to forward a democratic agenda and resist against this monopolization of the revolution by the Islamists that allowed the present disastrous conditions to develop. Is that correct?
The reasons are more complicated and diverse. What I'm saying, though, is that the lack of such an alliance and collective will prevented the left from resisting the monopolization of the revolution, even though it did not cause it. And one of the reasons for the lack of such a solidarity was that gap between national consciousness as a racially exclusive idea and minorities' resistance, particularly the Kurdish movement.
Yeah, well, I think these kinds of gaps, reconciling the national question with other kinds of collective wills or agendas to create unified bases, is one that the left still has not been able to grapple with or come to terms with today. But this dynamic that you are describing, the general lack of a unified alliance of progressive forces in a particular moment, creating the conditions that allow for extreme reactionary forces to come to power, is one we've seen repeated throughout so many different contexts in world history that have led to a series of other tragic moments around the world. So from the situation in 1979 that we've been discussing, following the accession of the Islamists to power, how did military force and state violence come to dominate the relation between the Kurds and the Iranian state?
Following the referendum, the Kurds engaged more actively in armed conflicts against the state, and the state brutal responses led to numerous instances of widespread violence, massacres, and even genocide. The Iran-Iraq war began amidst these conflicts and had negative consequences both for the Kurdish resistance and for the maintenance of their democratic integrity. On the one hand, the war isolated the Kurds and made them lose the support they were receiving from the Kurds at the other side of the border. And it also led to the migration of people to more central areas, particularly Tehran. In 1983, amidst the Iraqi invasion, Iran launched an offensive against the Kurds and brought a vast part of Rojhelat under the control of the Revolutionary Guards, which further forced many others to seek refuge elsewhere. An interesting point here is the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite its claim of founding a state based on religious unity and tolerance of at least some minority religions and the irrelevance of ethnicity and race, it did not follow the Islamist idea of Ummah. So I do not mean here to defend this concept, not at all, or to accept any mystical narrative of the patrimonial pluralism and tribalism of pre-modern empires, dynasties being cosmopolitan heavens. Such accounts are rather mystical and historically invalid. The point is to highlight the contradiction which is important to understanding the roots of some forms of violence in Iran today, that the Islamic Republic has not even followed the form of pluralism they claim to have existed in Muslim societies throughout the history. In contradiction to those acclaimed values, the Islamic Republic inherited and resumed the mission of the previous modern states by institutionalizing the racially exclusive nation of Iran and the Iranian colonialism and the internal colonialism of the nation state of Iran. Not only this, but also the Islamic Republic have had contributed into this nationalism ideology in two ways. First, it has emptied the concept of the Iranian nation of the very little secular spirit it had left, infusing it further with Shia Islam and intensifying its racialized and militarized elements, both by further securitizing minorities' problems and depoliticizing their cultural specificities. And second, the Islamic Republic had tied the project of internal colonialism to its imperialist adventures in the region as the two pillars of its security apparatus. The Islamic Republic justifies both its foreign policies and its oppression of minorities on the ground of protecting national borders, national sovereignty, and national security. Two things in particular underlie this rhetoric. One is the way in which the Islamic Republic has, since its founding, been an anti-US imperialist state. The other is the systemic crisis that hit the region at the end of the Cold War, which brought regional powers, some of them were backed by the US, and some resisting its domination in different ways, into hegemonic competition. So perhaps in a similar way to the time of the Constitutional Revolution, it has led the Islamic Republic to justify its internal colonialism and imperial adventures by hiding behind this veil of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist mask of resistance against the US imperialism. Kurdish resistance is tied to this project in two ways directly. First, any success in other parts of Kurdistan raises the possibility of further insurgency in Iran, hence threatening the state's power, territorial integrity. In a state's official discourses, even minorities resistances are usually called as external enemies conspiracy to bring the state's anti-imperial resistance down. And the second point is Kurdish insurgencies are by and large a threat to Iran's strategic interests in countries in which it has expanded its strategic fronts, particularly in Syria and after Saddam in Iraq. Currently, Iran is collaborating with Turkey in invading Kurdish forces in north of Iraq, for instance, despite the two countries, Iran and Turkey, supporting opposite parties of the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, for instance. Hence, I want to say that some tactical alliances between even Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Iranian state must not be confused with Iran's supporting of Iraqi Kurds' demands, which is completely at odds with its security strategies, essentially, not tactically. The Islamic Republic's security apparatus, hence, is basically based on these two pillars of internally colonizing and externally imperializing practices. And the Kurdish question is a very important node in understanding the functioning of this security apparatus.
That's a very interesting analysis that you're offering here. So if I understand you correctly, you're relating the internal dynamic between the state and minorities within the territory of Iran and the external dynamic of the Iranian state's practices towards other states in the region. And you have tied these dynamics together through what you have described as the Iranian state's internal colonial project to consolidate state power within its borders via sovereignty, and its external imperialist tendencies in the region as part of its project to increase the power and influence of the state. So given this, the shared basis of these internal and external practices of the Iranian state, which maybe we could call a tendency for power accumulation, what does that mean for the project of democratizing the Iranian state and the so-called Middle East region as a whole?
The connectivity of internal colonialism and imperializing behaviors in Iran, which is not an exclusive strategy just to Iran. We can see similar patterns in Turkey and elsewhere, implies that the question of the democratization and decentralization of Iran are not separable from each other and from the question of peace and democracy in the region. The roots of this connectivity are too long to discuss here, of course, but one important thing is the close tie between homogenizing and unitary national ideologies and centralization practices and militarism. So minorities have a demand for the right to self-determination. And at stake here is not just the right of individuals, but communities and societies, a right to collective and communal existence and self-determination, not just culturally, but also politically. Anything less than that will lead to the monopolization of power by a few and will imply a top-down imposition of racialized norms. And this imposition is impossible without the use of violence and hence militarism, of course. Both a centralized understanding of politics and a racialized understanding of political community enables and necessitates the rise of militarized states. Consequently, militarization will not suddenly disappear with the fall of the Islamic Republic, which unfortunately is one of the mainstream assumptions in Iran, and neither will democracy be automatically installed. That said, unfortunately, this connection is not broadly appreciated by many opposition forces in Iran. The problem is, despite their opposition to the Islamic Republic's Islamic ideological rhetoric, a large part of the Iranian society, perhaps unconsciously, are enforcing two of its ideological pillars, two of the Islamic Republic's ideological pillars. The first is the nationalist ideology. Many see Iranian nationalism as at odds with the Islamic Republic's mingling of nationalist ideology with Shia Islam and latch on to alternative stories built around mystical narratives of the Persian Empire, the Aryan race, and so on. Others still cherish the memory of the constitutional revolution as a glorious moment before and beyond the later corruptions. Hence, the territorial integrity of Iran and the homogenizing notion of the Iranian nation are not challenged and are taken for granted. Consequently, minorities movements are attacked by a good large part of the civil society by the use of the same rhetoric that the Islamic Republic deploys. For instance, calling them ethnicities rather than nations, threats against national security and territorial integrity, separatist movements, or people who are abusing basically anti-Islamic Republic social movements, etc. Even social movements in the center look at the margins suspiciously, rarely, if ever, following their initiatives. One of the examples I gave you was about the Kurdish boycotting of the referendum at the beginning of the revolution that very few non-Kurdish organizations followed. Hence, they have a tacit alliance with Islamic Republic in not only oppressing minorities, but also, perhaps unintentionally, suppressing democratic capacities of social movements. So the point is, in order to build solidarity, one needs to first appreciate diversity and appreciate the colonial construction of that collectivity. Without that, any claim to solidarity and unification bears different forms of exclusion through inclusion. It would be basically homogenization, not solidarity. And the second point is the dominant understanding of resistance, which still appeals to most, if not all of the Iranian left, is pretty much stuck in the Cold War imagination. This view still understands resistance as resistance against US imperialism, and at times has come to support Iran's imperial maneuvers in the region on the ground that they support Palestine and oppose the US. In this framework, for instance, Rojava movement is not accepted, for it is weakening those states which are among the main supporters of the Palestinian cause, for instance, Syria and Iran as well, and so on. So both of these ideological pillars of Iranian nationalism and anti-US imperialism, a Cold War understanding of resistance, are quite in common between the Islamic Republic and a very large part of their opposition forces.
Well, there was a lot of interesting points that you raised there, but there's a couple I want to touch in particular. One which stood out to me was the issue of the division between different groups, nations, movements, and even divisions within the Kurdish population itself that you mentioned, both historically and in the present time, and how this has created a situation of social and political impasse within Iran and the region more generally, which is exacerbated by the classical imperialist divide and rule strategy that the Iranian state is employing. Additionally, you made a very interesting point that for numerous reasons, the dispersal of the Fars nation in the center of the Iranian nation-state territory and the minorities in the border areas of the Iranian state territory creates a particular kind of center-periphery dynamic within the Iranian nation-state territory and between these different national groups, different social movements, etc. But unfortunately, I don't think we have enough time to explore that further, but that is very fascinating. But however, to return to this point about division and impasse, this ties back to what we discussed regarding the 1979 revolution. That such division, the lack of unified organization or platforms, means that effective democratic resistance cannot be developed. And when this is coupled with surging reactionary forces, the conditions for catastrophe or a tragic moment are created. So following on from this, what are your view of the prospects for the democratic confederalism project of the Kurdish freedom movement for building links that can overcome these divisions or develop new modes of anti-imperial resistance, both in Iran specifically and in the region more generally? That is, what do you think are the strengths and the potential stumbling blocks of democratic confederalism as a proposed solution to the impasse of the region?
There's really no short answer to these questions, as you mentioned. These are various material and ideological, local and international elements affecting the prospect of democratic confederalism in Iran and in the region. That are impossible to really address here without simplifying the project. But I just want to briefly mention a few points about democratic confederalism that are directly relevant to our discussion. Analytically, democratic confederalism is the only living example of resistance in the region that is built upon a systematic analysis of the relationship between local and global forms of injustice, those global structures that have basically impolite this center-periphery hierarchical relationship in Iran and elsewhere. There are other anti-nation statist voices here and there in other countries, but compared to democratic confederalism, they are minor, unorganized, and do not offer a systematic analysis and solution of the situation. One of the main questions that democratic confederalism tries to answer is of the systematic connection between the global and local forms of oppression. For instance, through exploring the roots of the Kurdish question, democratic confederalism addresses a more general and fundamental question of why and how does a system produce zones of exclusion and a statelessness, and how this is tied to other forms of systematic violence, including, but not limited to, colonization, militarization, racialization, sexism, and so on. Far from being utopian, so I think democratic confederalism is very realistic in its understanding of the root causes of oppression and the deadlock of wars and oppressive regimes in the region. The co-constitutive relation of the three projects of democratic nation, democratic confederalism, and democratic civilization that are developed in tandem to resist nation-state, nationalism as is associated with nation-state, and capitalist modernity in different political scales, imply that the theory simultaneously resists those ideologies and forces through which the bloody marriage of internal colonialism and imperial foreign policies, imperialism of some regional states are formed, while making it clear that resisting these two fronts require resisting the very systematic forces that have produced them, basically like capitalist modernity and its colonial imperial racialized connotations. Another point is, one way to understand democratic confederalism's idea of democratic nation, and in parentheses, democratization of nation is definitely like one of the main steps that, for instance, a nation like Iran needs to take in order to go beyond all those racialized, militarized, basically connotations of their nationalist ideology. Is true. Its function, the function of the concept of democratic nation, and deconstructing the linear relationship between territory, sovereignty, and political community, which, as I said, underlie racialized nations, racialized nationalist ideologies. While the relationship between territory and identity is not negated in the framework of democratic nation, they do not imply one another in a linear and homogenized way that connects them to a center of power. So here, territory, A, does not encapsulate a homogenized political community, and B, its relationship to other political communities that fall outside its borders is not determined in a dualistic us versus them opposition, because the system is actually so flexible as to be able to offer everyone a solution. This is like a different understanding of politics, especially international, or basically better to say transnational politics, perhaps, other than like a form of existence in which each party's existence is a threat to the others. This untying process of the relationship between territory, borders, sovereignty with the political community as a homogenized whole is not a top-down fabrication, but is developed through the open-ending practice of bottom-up direct democracy, in which people take part not as abstract citizens, but as members of various democratic communities. And this is precisely this bottom-up and communitarian form of the practice of democracy and the type of relationship to the land and living space it enables, cities, neighborhoods, etc. As well as that, this is precisely because of this that the system is able to, or at least in theory, claims to be able to manage to avoid such us versus them hostile understandings of politics. But of course, as I said, this is too big of a topic to address. Indeed, the future of democratic confederalism depends on, as many have argued, its ability to maintain its radically democratic values in the paradoxical relation of the need to survive and the need to resist homogenizing forces of the rules of survival in the international system, and to resist the systematic paradoxes that usually rise from the very act of proliferation and expansion of a model that always brings up the question of the paradoxes of sovereignty, security, and democracy, i.e., that which preserves the paradox between that which preserves a system against destructive forces and democratic values of a system and its claim to be open to the coming of the communities. So how can we stop basically stop only enough destructive forces, but not too much? These are all paradoxes of the relationship between sovereignty and democracy. These are not impossible questions to answer, but certainly there is no simple and short answer to them. More importantly, regardless of all theorizations, such answers could and will only develop in praxis. And of course, there is always a problem of solidarity in the practice of these practices, since the paradoxes I mentioned above are not exclusive to Iran. Nationalist ideology, Cold War understanding of resistance, so on and so forth, these are quite predominant across the region. But despite all these, democratic confederalism, as I said, is probably the only realistic solution in terms of addressing and resisting the roots of the impasse of the region, the intersection of most of which have come to shape the Kurdish question.
I hear you. There's much work that remains to be done and many questions that must be answered, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Sara.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's been both very fascinating and enlightening. Thank you.